Over the years, the vast majority of rail infrastructure in the northeastern Pennsylvania area has eroded to a point which would be almost unbelievable to someone who may have been here in the 1950s through the early 1970s. Being born and raised in northeastern Pennsylvania and having lived here most of my life, I've gradually embarked on a project to document some of what still exists of the abandoned and remaining rail lines with videos, photographs, and supporting maps. In the last quarter of the 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th, the railroads who served northeastern Pennsylvania were major carriers of anthracite, the hard, clean-burning coal found in abundance in NEPA. The popularity of anthracite spurred the growth and expansion of the railroads that served the area, most notably the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, the Central Railroad of New Jersey, the Delaware and Hudson, the Erie, the New York, Ontario, and Western, the Lehigh Valley, and the Great Pennsylvania Railroad. The Lackawanna and Wyoming Valley Railroad, aka the Laurel Line, an electric interurban short line, began operating in 1903. It served local passenger and freight needs. Coal and railroads created a huge industrial complex in the Lackawanna and Wyoming valleys. Early Eastern railroads were an amalgam of smaller railroad lines combined through mergers, consolidations, and leases. Sound familiar? Northeastern Pennsylvania was a melting pot for immigrants who chose the Lackawanna and Wyoming valleys as the place to make a better life for themselves and their families. Those who settled in the area, some 30 ethnic groups, sought employment in silk mills, iron and steel factories, coal mines, and with railroads. In fact, at its peak, the railroad yards employed thousands of workers, mostly immigrants and the sons and grandsons of immigrants who came to the United States during the last half of the 19th century. Northeastern Pennsylvania's economic fortunes followed those of the railroads that served it and began to decline in the mid-1920s when the demand for anthracite coal started to subside. By the 1930s and 40s, gas and oil were replacing coal as a home and industrial fuel. The railroads began using diesel locomotives, reducing the need for coal even further. Many of the railroad's various facilities in the area closed from then on, all the way through the devastation of 1972's Hurricane Agnes, and ended with Conrail, who by 1980 think the Staggers Act here had cast most of northeast Pennsylvania aside. Today, northeastern Pennsylvania is served by several railroads: the Norfolk Southern, the Canadian Pacific until 2015, the Reading and Northern, the Lehigh Railway, the Delaware Lackawanna, and the Luzerne and Susquehanna. Just for the record, the Luzerne and Susquehanna and the Lehigh Railway are now under R.J. Corman. Although most of northeastern Pennsylvania's rich rail history is sadly long gone now, there is still a lot of railroading in the area to enjoy, if you know where to look. This is the state of Pennsylvania as interpreted by the Norfolk Southern Railroad. The lines in red are NS lines, while the lines in purple are interchange partners. This is also the state of Pennsylvania as interpreted by the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, or commonly called PennDOT. As you can see, I've quartered it out to give you my interpretation of northeastern Pennsylvania. Moving in closer, I've included some of southeastern Pennsylvania, most specifically Allentown, Bethlehem, Phillipsburg, New Jersey, and almost to Reading. This is the geographical area that I'm referencing in this series of the history of railroading in northeastern Pennsylvania. This tangled mess is the city of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Pittston City and some of the many coal breakers are also included, as they're all located in Luzerne County. Those colored lines are rail lines, at least most of them. The bad news is that most of it's gone today, but the good news is that I'm here to help you make sense of the whole thing. In its heyday, the Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania area was a very complicated area railroad-wise, with the CNJ, the Lehigh Valley, the Delaware and Hudson, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Lackawanna, the Erie, and the Lackawanna and Wyoming Valley Laurel Line There were tracks seemingly everywhere. From its northernmost terminus of Montreal, Quebec, Canada, the D&H pretty much ended in Wilkes-Barre with a paper company called the Wilkes-Barre Connecting Railway. Jointly owned with the Pennsylvania Railroad, it was essentially used to connect the two roads and bypass the congested downtown. By the early 1970s, the D&H's main yard in town was known as the Hudson Yard. This was originally part of the Wilkes-Barre and Eastern, which was a subsidiary of the New York, Susquehanna, and Western. After the WB&E was abandoned, this section was sold to become the Wilkes-Barre Connecting Railway. Amazingly, while the Pennsy and the D&H are now gone, the New York, Susquehanna, and Western still operates to this day. The Delaware and Hudson, Pennsylvania division itself ran from the connection with the Pennsylvania Railroad at Buttonwood Yard in Wilkes-Barre to the Erie Railroad's main line near Lanesboro and north to the D&H's Susquehanna division at Nineveh, New York. Today, what's left of the Hudson Yard is a forest of new growth trees, but the main line itself is still intact. It's 2025, and from where we're standing, this is what things looked like 50 years ago. For many years, the Hudson Yard was the D&H's southbound endpoint. All that changed in 1976 when it moved to Sunbury, Pennsylvania. Still, the Delaware and Hudson pushed even further south via trackage rights over the newly formed Conrail to Harrisburg and Enola, all the way to Alexandria, Virginia, and the site of the former Potomac Yard. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back to Hudson. Just behind us a little ways is milepost HA 686, which is about where the Wilkes-Barre Connecting Railroad began. It was incorporated at the end of 1912 and construction began in 1913. It was formed for the joint benefit of the Delaware and Hudson and the Pennsylvania Railroad. The entire line of almost 7 miles was completed and placed in operation on March 29, 1915. Outside of the Wilkes-Barre Connecting Railroad itself, little is left of the original Delaware and Hudson today, but today's NS still calls it the NSD&H, and the main line stays hot, even in the bitter cold of winter.
Kingston. Check box number 2. Proceeds from CP 699 699 to CP 714 714. Going track. Track 30 3055 3055. One box, that's 2.
A little ways down the line, the Wilkes-Barre Connecting Railroad crosses over the Susquehanna River, and if you notice that solitary rock at the bottom of the screen, while I can't say for certain, I do believe that rock is actually the remains of a bridge pier from the original Wilkes-Barre and Eastern Bridge at that site. What I can say for certain is that the rusty steel overhead is what little remains of the Lackawanna and Wyoming Valley Laurel line that ended passenger service in 1952 and freight service in 1976. And as a little bonus on the bridge, a train. And this one has a rare white-faced Dash 9 leading this Norfolk Southern Train 14R.
with the box 2, no longer proceeding CP 714, CP 699 on the main, limits clear, 323. 323 in the PM by Carling, over.
When it comes to train watching in northeastern Pennsylvania, Wilkes-Barre is my hometown and original rail fanning stomping ground. At milepost 690, the bridge crosses the Susquehanna River from the city's southwest side into Edwardsville and Kingston before crossing the river back again into Wilkes-Barre on the north side. The bridge at 690 is known by locals as the Black Diamond Bridge, owing that moniker to the area's coal mining past. The railroad calls it the Fish Island Bridge. The Susquehanna River that it crosses, though tranquil and peaceful most of the time, is also one of the primary reasons for Wilkes-Barre's catastrophic decline in rail infrastructure. In 1959, the Knox coal mine disaster caused by reckless mining flooded large portions of the area's coal mines to the point that they could not be reopened and ended large-scale coal mining in Wilkes-Barre forever. In 1972, Hurricane Agnes practically wiped out downtown Wilkes-Barre overnight when floodwaters covered it in 9 feet of water. Nearly 250,000 people were left homeless as 400,000 homes and businesses, including the railroads, were destroyed. In 2003, a levee system was built that successfully resisted other storms in 2004 and particularly in 2006 when Wilkes-Barre made national front-page headlines when 200,000 people were told to evacuate. This was because of flooding that was predicted to reach the levels of Hurricane Agnes in 1972. From the railroad side of things, the flooding in downtown Wilkes-Barre signaled the beginning of the end for the rail operations there. At least 4 railroads converged in downtown, and in 1972, the Central New Jersey was the first to pull out, curtailing all of its Pennsylvania Railroad operations to the Lehigh Valley Railroad. The stretch of the Sunbury line from milepost 692 to around 686 was originally the Wilkes-Barre connecting railroad between the Pennsylvania Railroad's Buttonwood Yard to the south and the D&H's Hudson Yard to the north, and by the early 1970s, the now Penn Central and the D&H were doing their interchanging in either of those places, leaving only the D&H and the Lehigh Valley interchanging in downtown Wilkes-Barre. In 1976, Conrail was formed and the railroad map of the Northeast United States was changed forever. Closer to home, the Pennsylvania Railroad Wilkes-Barre branch from Sunbury to Buttonwood, along with the Wilkes-Barre Connecting Railroad, became the sole property of the Delaware and Hudson, and all railroad interchanging in downtown Wilkes-Barre was gone. In the early 1980s, Conrail sold the D&H the ex-Lackawanna line from Taylor Yard to Binghamton, New York, and what we know today as the Sunbury line was formed. Because of Big Blue's dominance in the Northeast, the D&H found itself in a life-and-death struggle to stay independent, as well as alive. Shortly after the Lackawanna line purchase, Guilford Industries, what we now know today as Pan Am Railways, took over the D&H and operated it until the late 1980s when they placed the D&H into bankruptcy. Until a buyer could be found for the D&H, the New York, Susquehanna, and Western operated it from 1989 until about 1991 when the Canadian Pacific took control, making that Suzy Q SD60 that we just saw in Train 14R more at home on these rails than the casual observer may have realized. Also at home on the Wilkes-Barre Connecting Railroad is the Penn Central Heritage Unit number 1073, which also came up on Train 14R the very next day. Now firmly in Luzerne County, we come to an important junction on the line, Dupont Junction. In January 1973, a connection was made between the Lehigh Valley and the Delaware and Hudson in Dupont, Pennsylvania. The connection, called Dupont Junction, allowed for a seamless routing of traffic such as symbol freights NE84 and NE87 between the two roads that largely eliminated the need for an interchange point. Prior to the construction of Dupont Junction, NE84 would come down from Mountaintop on trackage rights over the C&J backtrack through Ashley and onto Lehigh Valley trackage at Franklin Junction. Franklin Junction was often a bottleneck where freights would wait for permission to travel through Wilkes-Barre so power and crews could be exchanged with the D&H at their yard. Conversely, NE87 would wait for permission to enter Wilkes-Barre Yard from the north to exchange crews and motive power. The construction of Dupont Junction eliminated these bottlenecks and provided the impetus for both roads to enter run-through agreements sharing motive power and crews. Hurricane Agnes and the resulting flood of June of 1972 caused a great deal of damage to the rail yards in downtown Wilkes-Barre. The C&J had already pulled out of Pennsylvania entirely and much of the area was slated for redevelopment. As such, there was no need for the D&H to maintain a presence in the middle of Wilkes-Barre, especially since Hudson Yard was less than 5 miles away and could handle any local business. The D&H and Lehigh Valley trains that ran through Dupont Junction often used a matched set of Alco C628s and a Northeastern style caboose. After C-Day in 1976, the D&H continued to use the Lehigh line for run-through trains all the way through the takeovers of the D&H by Guilford in the 1980s and Canadian Pacific in 1991, as well as the buyout of the Lehigh line entirely from Conrail by the Reading and Northern in the mid-1990s. The Canadian Pacific continued to run through trains over the now R&N Lehigh line until September of 2015 when CP sold the D&H South lines to the Norfolk Southern and exited Pennsylvania. Norfolk Southern ran through trains 36T and 37T over the Lehigh line to its own Lehigh line until 2020.